History, the show where we share our favorite stories from Boston history. This is episode 49, The Tongs and the Great Chinatown Raid. Hi, I'm Nikki.
And I'm Jake. This week, we're going to discuss the early history of Boston's Chinatown, 2 murders that took place there at the turn of the 20th century, and a terrifying crackdown on Chinese Americans in Boston that sparked an international incident and has parallels in today's headlines. But before we talk about Chinatown, it's time to take a look at what's coming up this week in Boston history.
Monday is October 9th, and on October 9th, 1635, Roger Williams was banished from Massachusetts Bay Colony. He had originally arrived here in 1631 and spent time as a minister in Salem and Plymouth. His increasingly radical beliefs led him to fall out from favor in the colony. He believed that Native Americans owned the land in New England and that the English should pay them for it, that Massachusetts churches should separate themselves from the established church in England, and, most controversially, that people should enjoy freedom of conscience, saying, "Forced worship stinks in God's nostrils." He was brought before the court of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in October of 1635, and on the 9th, he was found guilty of the following charges. Whereas Mr. Roger Williams, one of the elders of the Church of Salem, hath broached and divulged divers new and dangerous opinions against the authority of magistrates, and yet maintaineth the same without retraction. It is therefore ordered that said Mr. Williams shall depart out of this jurisdiction within 6 months now ensuing. Mr. Williams holds forth these 4 particulars. First, that we have not our land by patent from the king, but that natives are the true owners of it, and that we ought to repent of such a receiving of it by patent. Second, that it is not lawful to call a wicked person to swear, to pray, as being actions of God's worship. Third, that it is not lawful to hear any of the ministers of the parish assemblies in England. Fourth, that the civil magistrate's power extends only to the bodies and goods and outward state of men. That winter, he walked out of the colony with nothing but the clothes on his back and his pockets stuffed with corn paste. He would later say that for 14 weeks he knew not what bread or bed did mean. During this time, he relied on the kindness of the Wampanoag tribe and other Native Americans for his survival, having earlier traded with them and established a trusting relationship. In the spring, he settled along the Narragansett Bay, purchasing land from the Narragansett people and inviting his remaining followers from Massachusetts to join him. That settlement would become Providence Plantation, which we now know today as Rhode Island.
A violent storm known alternately as the October Storm or the Snow Hurricane slammed into Boston on October 10, 1804. The Newburyport Herald describes what happened. Tremendous storm. The wind blew at first from south-southeast and then shifted to east, increasing its power until 4 o'clock, when it abated for a few moments, and then veered to northeast. From this quarter, the gale blew with a violence and fury unprecedented in the annals of this town. The damage which has been sustained by this tremendous hurricane cannot at present be estimated, but it is very great and extensive. The source then describes the damage or destruction of 27 ships anchored in Boston Harbor, and the death of a young man who had been working to keep one of them afloat, before going on to describe the effect on the town. The damage sustained in the interior of the town has been considerable. Scarcely a tree, particularly the poplars which ornamented almost every yard and garden, is standing. Many of the houses are unroofed, and some of the new buildings are so much bent and twisted that if they do not fall of themselves, they must be taken down. The North Church steeple, which experienced the power of the gale on Tuesday night, fell on an adjoining house and crushed it to pieces. The family who rented the house were all of them fortunately on a visit at the time, or they must have perished amid the ruins. One of the western stages in passing the West Boston Bridge was upset by the force of the wind, and several of the passengers considerably hurt. The Baptist meeting house is partly unroofed, and the spire of Reverend Dr. Morse's meeting house is very much bent, but being newly and strongly built, the steeple stood the gale. The roof of the Tower of King's Chapel was wrenched off by the violence of the wind and carried 200 feet before it fell. So we have evidence of a storm with hurricane-force winds that were enough to overturn a stagecoach as it was traveling fully loaded, and to destroy numerous buildings. Even the steeple of Old North Church, where Robert Newman hung 2 lanterns to warn Charlestown patriots that the British were advancing by sea, was destroyed. A new steeple would take its place until being itself blown down by Hurricane Carol 150 years later. As severe as the damage was in Boston, we got lucky. In some parts of the state, those hurricane-force winds were coupled with up to 30 inches of snow and temperatures so frigid that potatoes froze in the ground.
Wednesday is October 11th. It's easy to think of slavery and support for slavery before the Civil War as being a uniquely Southern problem. However, there were plenty of people in Massachusetts who were either ardently pro-slavery or at least willing to live with slavery in order to keep the American Union from dissolving. At the time, the political parties held views on race that were dramatically opposite from where they stand today. The Republicans were anti-slavery, sometimes veering into radicalism. The Democrats were, in the South, very vocally in favor of slavery. Here in the North, that tended to be toned down, and one was more likely to encounter local Democrats who spoke as Unionists. At the invitation of the local Democratic Party, a popular second-term U.S. Senator from Mississippi named Jefferson Davis spoke at Faneuil Hall on October 10, 1858. Though Davis would later become the President of the Confederate States of America, that night his appearance was billed as an address in favor of states' rights democracy and against secession. Very ironic. Why is it, I say, that you are thus agitated in relation to the domestic affairs of other communities? Why is it that the peace of the country is disturbed in order that one people may assume to judge of what another people should do? Is there any political power to authorize such interference? If so, where is it? Where is the grant of the Constitution which confers on the federal government a right to determine what shall be property? Surely none such exists. That question, it belongs to every community to settle for itself. Why, then, in the absence of all control over the subject of African slavery, are you agitated in relation to it? With pharisaical pretension, it is sometimes said, it is a moral obligation to agitate, and I suppose they are going through a sort of vicarious repentance for other men's sins. Who gave them a right to decide that it is a sin? By what standard do they measure it? Not the Constitution. The Constitution recognizes the property in many forms and imposes obligations in connection with that recognition. Not the Bible. That justifies it. Not the good of society, for if they go where it exists, they find that society recognizes it as good. What, then, is their standard? The good of mankind? Is that seen in the diminished resources of the country? Is that seen in the diminished comfort of the world? Or is it not the reverse exhibited? Is it in the cause of Christianity? It cannot be, for servitude is the only agency through which Christianity has reached that degraded race, the only means by which they have been civilized and elevated. Future trader Jefferson Davis tells us that slavery is nobody's business in Massachusetts, and if you make it your business, you have no right to interfere under the Constitution or the Bible. He says that slavery was not a necessary evil, but a positive good, and that keeping humans as property was supposed to be a good for both the owner and the owned.
Well, that's a hard quote to follow. Since the disease was nearly wiped out in the latter part of the 20th century, it's easy to forget how terrifying polio was during the early part of that century. The disease had been present in human populations throughout recorded history, but the U.S. was experiencing an epidemic of childhood polio during the early 20th century. Polio is a viral fever that strikes suddenly. It can cause paralysis, often of the lower extremities, and less commonly, of the lungs. In most cases, the paralysis is temporary, lasting 2 to 6 weeks, but in the most severe cases, it can be permanent. Even temporary paralysis of the lungs is a bad thing, of course, since it could cause death by suffocation. On October 12, 1928, a medical breakthrough enabled those struck with temporary or even permanent paralysis of the lungs to keep breathing. Dr. Philip Drinker, an industrial hygienist at the Harvard School of Public Health, had invented a device he called the iron lung. It was a long steel cylinder with a rubber diaphragm inside. On October 12th, a young girl with polio was placed inside the tube with only her head exposed. The rubber diaphragm was made snug around her neck, and 2 motors from household vacuum cleaners were powered on. First, one motor would suck the air out of the cylinder surrounding her tiny body, forcing her lungs to expand and allowing her to inhale. Then the other motor would force the air back into the cylinder, her lungs would fall, and she'd exhale. The brother of a later patient described what it was like to be in the room with her while the iron lung helped her breathe. She talks so that you can barely hear her. She talks on the exhale because she cannot talk on the inhale, which means that her sentences are interrupted 15 times each minute for the breathing machine to make her breathe, which makes conversation with her quite leisurely. Long pauses in the sentences, and everyone learns to be patient. For the next 30 years, Drinker's iron lung and competing models were the best hope for many patients. As polio rates declined, demand for the iron lung dropped to almost zero. The first common vaccine against polio was developed by Jonas Salk in 1952. After that, rates of infection in the US plummeted, with the disease being declared eradicated in North and South America by 1994. Efforts to rid the world of the disease are ongoing, with some authorities projecting that they could be successful by the end of 2018. Like I always say, vaccinate your kids, people.
Friday is October 13th, and on October 13th, 1914, the Boston Braves completed the first sweep in modern World Series history. By the time of the 1914 series, the Philadelphia Athletics were a baseball dynasty. They had made several World Series appearances and were heavily favored going into the season. The Braves, on the other hand, were dead last in the National League through 4th of July weekend. In the latter half of the season, they came back to win the National League pennant by 10.5 games. Even after this string of luck, the Miracle Braves were underdogs for the series. The first 2 games were played in Philadelphia on October 9th and 10th, where the Braves won 7-1 and then 1-0. On October 12th, the series moved back to Boston. Ironically, though, the Braves still didn't enjoy a home field advantage. At that time, the Braves played at the South End grounds on Columbus Avenue near today's Northeastern University campus. However, Fenway Park, the newer, larger, and more attractive home of the Red Sox, was chosen as a more profitable venue for the World Series games. The 4th game at Fenway tied early at 2 runs each and went into extra innings. In the 10th, it looked like a Philadelphia win after Frank Baker batted in 2 runs. The Braves answered in the bottom of the 10th and tied it up again. Finally, in the 12th inning, pinch runner Les Mann scored for the Braves on a bunt by Herbie Moran, giving them the win. The next night was October 13th, and the Boston Braves completed their sweep, winning 3-1. In his book about the Braves, Harold Keza wrote, "Boston never knew a wilder baseball celebration than that which followed the 4th game. Thousands of fans swarmed around the Boston dugout, and manager Stallings had to make a speech. Rabbit Marinville was dragged from the showers, and half-dressed, he too spoke to the crowd from the roof of the dugout. Then, the crowd paraded, with the band playing Tessie and Along Came Ruth around the park, through the fens, down Huntington Avenue, and to Copley Square, where the Beaton Athletics were serenaded in their hotel, the Copley Plaza. There were fully 5,000 fans in the human chain, and thrust to its head were all the Braves who came in sight, especially Marinville, who needed no thrusting. Yet, somehow the fans managed not to riot, which seems inevitable when our city wins a major sporting championship in more recent times."
In keeping with a theme we've mentioned many times on the show, religious minorities were not welcomed in early Puritan Massachusetts. Quakers in particular were reviled, and special laws were put into place to try to keep their beliefs from spreading. On October 14, 1656, the General Court enacted a new law against an accursed and pernicious sect of heretics lately risen up in the world, who are commonly called Quakers, who take upon them to be immediately sent of God and infallibly assisted, who do speak and write of blasphemous things, despising government and the order of God and church and commonwealth. The law imposed penalties on any shipmaster who knowingly brought Quakers into the colony, but the harshest penalties were reserved for those who would profess the forbidden faith. Upon the first offense, they would be banished, and then every Quaker coming into the jurisdiction after having once been punished should, for the first offense, suffer the loss of one ear. For a second offense, the loss of the other, and for a third, should have the tongue bored through with a hot iron. A year later, the penalties were increased. All such Quakers formally convicted and punished as such shall, if they return again, be imprisoned, and forthwith banished or expelled out of the said jurisdiction under pain of death. And if afterwards they presume to come again into that jurisdiction, then to be put to death as presumptuously incorrigible, unless they shall plainly and publicly renounce their cursed opinions. After a series of Quaker martyrs were executed in Boston, King Charles II ordered an end to the death penalty for religious dissenters in all his colonies in 1661.
Finally, Sunday is October 15th. Boston Symphony Orchestra opened its inaugural season in 1881. For almost 2 decades, they performed at Boston Music Hall, which has since been converted into the Orpheum Theater. Then, the orchestra engaged a distinguished architecture firm to design them a new home. The new building, on the corner of Huntington and Massachusetts Avenues, would be long, tall, and narrow, a shoebox shape based on Leipzig, Germany's Gewandhaus. The orchestra opened its new home on October 15, 1900. A classical music critic writes glowingly of the sound in Symphony Hall, considered one of the finest concert halls in the world. Its architects were the distinguished firm of McKim, Mead, and White, who invited a young Harvard physics professor, Wallace Clement Sabine, possibly because of some calculations he had done for Harvard's Fog Museum, to advise them about acoustics. His advice is now considered the first truly scientific approach to concert hall acoustics, the birth of architectural acoustics. Sabine seemed to have figured out the magic formula for the effective absorption and reverberation of sound, neither too dry nor too echoey. As he explained it to me, the sound produced on the stage not only goes directly into the hall, but also bounces off everything in sight and earshot, side and rear walls and ceiling, at minutely different times. That combination, the magic formula for absorption and reverberation, is what creates the overall hearing experience. Today, Boston Symphony Hall is considered one of the 3 finest music halls in the world, alongside its sister halls in Vienna and Amsterdam.
And now on to our main topic. On a warm summer evening in 1907, businesses were closing up shop for the day. In the narrow streets and alleyways of Boston's Chinatown, people leaned in doorways smoking, or gathered on stoops to chat. In the tiny T-shaped alley called Oxford Street, a group of men quietly took their prearranged positions and waited for a signal. Against the backdrop of this ordinary streetscape, somebody lit a string of firecrackers. This wasn't entirely unheard of in Chinatown, but these firecrackers were a signal. As the firecrackers went off, the group loitering on Oxford Street pulled out pistols and began firing indiscriminately into the crowd of people mingling in the evening air. Panic immediately followed, with people diving for cover, fleeing into stores, or running for safety on Harrison Street. Within seconds, 3 men were killed, and 7 more fell wounded. The shooters immediately fled, blending into the frightened crowd that was racing away from the scene. As every available Boston police unit converged on Chinatown, a rumor began to spread. It said that the shooters were paid thugs, hatchet men organized by the hip sing Tong to demonstrate why businesses should be paying protection money to the Tong. While ambulances were still on the scene and undertakers' wagons were collecting the bodies, the police were already going door to door in Chinatown. They kicked in doors, searching for anyone who might be a witness or a suspect with a connection to the hip sing Tong. Throughout Chinatown, people feared that they were about to witness a repeat of the traumatic police raids that had followed an earlier shooting in 1903.
Our story begins long before the bullets began to fly on that August evening. Boston's Chinatown neighborhood has its roots in the first large-scale wave of Chinese Americans to settle in Boston in 1874. They were part of a group of low-wage workers who had been brought from San Francisco to North Adams to work as scabs during a garment workers' strike in 1870. After the strike was over, the immigrant workers could no longer count on finding work in North Adams, so many of them came to Boston. Here, they found employment in the city's garment district and started a community centered around the corner of Harrison and Beach that was at first known as Boston's Chinese Colony. The population grew quickly in the 1870s as more Chinese Americans moved to Boston to seek employment. The first Chinese restaurant, Hong Far Lo, opened in 1875. Also during the 1870s, laundries became an increasingly important industry for Chinese immigrants, as many other types of businesses began to discriminate against them. Soon, 1 in every 4 Chinese American men would be employed in the laundry business. As Chinese American immigrants moved across the nation from west to east, anti-Chinese sentiment and discrimination followed close behind. Chinese immigration to the West Coast had ramped up quickly during the California gold rush of the 1850s, and demand for Chinese American laborers remained high during the railroad boom of the 1860s. However, after the Civil War, the country settled into an economic recession. During these hard times, populist politicians scapegoated these immigrants as the cause of low wages among white American workers. Sounds pretty familiar.
Finally, in 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. While immigration from other nations would be essentially unregulated until the 1920s, this new law enacted a 10-year prohibition on anyone from China who might be employed as a laborer moving to the U.S. In practice, it was almost impossible to prove one's employment status, so immigration was frozen. The Chinese American community in Boston at that time was made up overwhelmingly of young male workers who then faced a devastating choice: leave the U.S. and probably never be allowed to return to their homes and jobs here, or stay and risk never seeing their families again. Over the next several years, amendments tightened the law, and then in 1892 the Geary Act renewed and extended it for another 10 years. Not only was immigration prohibited under the Geary Act, but anyone of Chinese descent in the U.S. was required to carry identification papers at all times. Their right of habeas corpus was revoked, and 2 white witnesses were required to swear to their immigration status if there was any dispute. Before it expired in 1902, the Geary Act would be indefinitely renewed. In the 1930s, elements of the law were relaxed to allow wives and families of Chinese Americans already in the U.S. to join them, and the law was allowed to expire in 1943, while the Republic of China was fighting as a valuable ally against the Japanese Empire in the Pacific Theater. Another murder in Boston's Chinatown provided the nominal excuse for a combined raid by Boston police and the U.S. Immigration Bureau in 1903. The raid, which indiscriminately scooped up anyone of Chinese descent, regardless of their immigration status, became so notorious that it led to a nationwide boycott of American-made goods in China for the next 2 years. Judge William Emmons had just been named Boston Police Commissioner, and he vowed to crack down on the gang violence, gambling, and opium dens that he claimed had taken over the city's Chinatown.
On October 2nd, 1903, Wang Yak Chong was ambushed and killed by 2 men in Chinatown in an attack that wounded 2 others. Wang, who owned a business in Roslindale, was reported to be a member of the hip Sing Tong. His 2 assailants, Wang Qing and Charlie Chin, were said to belong to the rival An Liang Tong. Tongs were organizations that hovered somewhere between secret societies and benevolent associations. They originated in mainland China and found particularly fertile soil in the eastern United States. As Chinese Americans moved further from the West Coast and the large immigrant communities there, they found more reasons to rely on the Tongs for support. Unfortunately, the Tongs were also far from their traditional power bases in China, and in Boston and New York, they began operating as organized crime syndicates. The Tongs ran gambling and opium dens, and in a situation where the Chinese Exclusion Act prevented most ethnically Chinese women from coming to the United States, they operated successful prostitution rings. It was against this background that Wang's murder played out. One early news report said that he was planning to sell his business and renounce the hip Sing Tong, and that he was killed out of fear that he would betray the Tong's secrets. Most news reports, though, say that he was at the center of a dispute over gambling debts between the Hip Sings and the An Liang Tong. The assassins, Wang Qing and Charlie Chin, were armed with Colt and Ivor Johnson revolvers. When he was arrested, Wang Qing was found to be wearing elaborate body armor concealed beneath his clothes. It was made up of many small pieces of sheet steel, about 2 inches square and 1/16 of an inch thick, joined by little bands of copper wire. One of the two men was found with an elaborate, traditional Chinese hunting axe. This fed White Boston's fear of Chinese-American gangsters, as it was associated with Tong assassins, hence the term hatchet men.
This was exactly the pretext that the Boston Police Department had been looking for. As Captain Lawrence Kane, the department's commander in Chinatown, said, "It is the first time that such a bloody feud has broken out among the Chinese in Boston. We must check it. That is the reason we have had to resort to such extreme measures. The community must be protected from such high-handed acts. We intend to take every precaution, even if innocent men are brought to the station." Wang Yak Chong's funeral was held on October 11th, and soon after he was buried at Mount Hope Cemetery, the police began breaking down doors in Chinatown. Because the two hatchet men were rumored to belong to the Onleong Tong, the raids tended to target them. However, doubt is cast on this focus on the Onleongs, and indeed their role in the murder itself, by persistent rumors that Police Commissioner Emmons had struck a deal with the Hip Sing Tong. In a story reminiscent of law enforcement's protection deal with Whitey Bulger's Winter Hill Gang nearly a century later, author Alan Rogers explains the situation. In fact, Emmons apparently made a corrupt bargain with the Hip Sing Tong. In exchange for information about illegal activities conducted by the Onleong Tong, the Boston police left Hip Sing alone. Throughout the summer and fall of 1903, for example, the police arrested scores of Onleong Tong members for gambling, but not a single member of Hip Sing. This tactic led directly to the violence. While the raids may have been nominally targeted at Onleong, in reality they became a generalized roundup of Chinese Americans. The BPD and immigration authorities fanned out through the neighborhood and swept up hundreds of ethnically Chinese Bostonians, regardless of any complicity in the shootings, Tong affiliation, immigration status, or possession of the required documentation.
George Billings, Immigration Commissioner for the Port of Boston, made it clear that the raids were deliberately indiscriminate. "We have had it in our mind for a long time to do something of this sort. We are satisfied that there are many unregistered Chinese in the city and in other places in New England. It required something like the murder of Wang, however, to give us the proper excuse for taking action. I think we have done our job pretty thoroughly tonight. I have no doubt that many of the Chinese we took tonight have their papers. They should have had them in their possession. Those who left them in their homes will have an opportunity tomorrow to produce them. If they have not got their papers, they will be deported." The Boston Herald describes the raids in the typically racist language of the day. "The officers dragged the frightened Chinamen out from under beds, from behind boxes and doors, and from all conceivable places of concealment. They were all driven down the winding stairways to the big marble hallway at the street entrance and huddled together like panting sheep. The jabbering was deafening and bewildering." In the Atlantic in 1906, former Secretary of State John W. Foster used more measured tones to recall a notorious case which occurred, not on the sandlots of California, nor under the auspices of labor agitators, but in the enlightened city of Boston and under the conduct of federal officials. The police and immigration officials fell upon their victims without giving a word of warning. The clubs, restaurants, other public places where the Chinese congregated, and private houses were surrounded. Every avenue of escape was blocked. To those seized, no warrant for arrest or other paper was read or shown. Every Chinese who did not at once produce his certificate of residence was taken in charge, and the unfortunate ones were rushed off to the federal building without further ceremony. There was no respect of persons with the officials. They treated merchants and laborers alike. In many cases, no demand was made for certificates. The captives were dragged off to imprisonment, and in some instances, the demand was not made till late at night or the next morning, when the certificates were in the possession of the victims at the time of their seizure.
By morning, 234 men were being held in custody. 122 were released within 24 hours, after producing the documents required under the Geary Act. 49 were released on bail in the first few days, and 11 were held in jail for many days until they could produce their documentation. Some of these men were residents from the suburbs who had been in town for the day and had to wait for friends or trusted acquaintances to find and produce their documents. Among those who were held the longest were at least 2 American citizens of Chinese descent. On October 16th, several hundred Bostonians gathered to protest at Faneuil Hall. William Lloyd Garrison, Jr., son of the famous abolitionist, gave the first address. "We are gathered to protest against the recent flagrant outrage upon ourselves and upon the fair fame of the city. It is a menace to constitutional government. A few Orientals serve today as a pretext for this encroachment of a power hostile to democratic institutions. Tomorrow the victims may be Negroes or Jews. The preliminary excuse for the brutality in Chinatown was the fact of a single and exceptional murder of one Chinaman by another, a crime almost of daily occurrence in other parts of the city among natives and foreigners. The pretense of the police cloaked a purpose to round up the Chinese colony and capture the pitiful number who were unable to produce on the instant their certificates. The chattel tag which the Great Republic, founded by immigrants from oppression, exacts of these later refugees. Imagine the tables turned, and American citizens in China corralled and dragged into confinement upon suspicion. The apathetic deadness of Boston would burst into volcanic wrath, and the Navy Yard bristle with activity. Or suppose a descent upon the Italian quarter were planned by the police, inspired by federal authority. Even let the Japanese be the intended victims. Strenuous and inflated as is our new world power, the United States would shrink from the attempt. The eagle seeks a helpless quarry."
Despite the protest, 50 Chinese Americans were deported. It remains unclear whether all, or indeed any of them, were residing in the U.S. without registering themselves with the authorities. Another 150 would leave the city by train before the end of October of 1903. It was the largest exodus of Chinese Americans from the area at any one time up to that point, and it was sparked by the raid and the ensuing insecurity ethnically Chinese people felt in Boston afterwards. The population of Boston's Chinatown had been somewhere around 600 before the raids. Reducing that number by a third was seen as a great success by the officials, who were dead set on ridding the city and nation of Chinese immigrants. One of the Chinese Americans who left Boston after the raids was Feng Shui. He moved to the Philippines and then later went back to China. His experiences with the Boston raid in particular, and life under the Chinese Exclusion Act in general, had radicalized Feng. When he arrived back in China, he published a book describing and denouncing the discrimination Chinese immigrants faced in America. In May 1905, the Shanghai Chamber of Commerce began advocating for a boycott of American-made goods in protest of the treatment of Chinese Americans. On July 16th, Feng Shui committed suicide in front of the American consulate in Shanghai. Days later, the boycott formally began, with Feng seen as a martyr to the boycott and the rising spirit of Chinese nationalism it encouraged. His memorial service stretched over 3 days, attracting thousands of mourners and orators who promoted the boycott. In response to the boycott, President Theodore Roosevelt would say, "We cannot expect China to do us justice unless we do China justice. The chief cause in bringing about the boycott of our goods in China was undoubtedly our attitude toward the Chinese who come to this country. Our laws and treaties should be so framed as to guarantee to all Chinamen, save for the exception of the coolie class, the same right of entry to this country and the same treatment while here, as is guaranteed to citizens of any other nation. By executive action, I am as rapidly as possible putting a stop to the abuses which have grown up during many years in the administration of this exclusion law." In the wake of the raids, Chinatown was bent, but not broken. Even the Tongs remained in Boston, and retained enough power to spark the massacre on Oxford Street in August of 1907. By the morning after the shooting, police had 5 members of the Hip Sing Tong in custody, and the next day they arrested 5 more. Among the latter arrests was a businessman named Wary Charles. He was suspected of being a high-level Hip Sing leader and having orchestrated the attack on the An Liang Tong as retaliation for the 1903 killing of Wong Yak Chong. When the trial started, 9 of the defendants were charged with first-degree murder, and Worry Charles was charged as an accessory before the fact. If they were convicted, all would be subject to the death penalty. The government called almost 90 witnesses, almost all of whom testified with the help of interpreters. The star witness was Waber Shoy Poi, who claimed to be a member of the Hip Sing Tong's ruling council. He said he had been in the room when Worry Charles proposed an attack on the Ong Leongs. One witness testified that Charles said that he would have to do some killing and make the Chinese businessmen so afraid that all of them would join our society, and laid out how he would bring in hatchetmen from New York and pay them and local assassins out of his pocket.
The defense put Charles on the stand. He flatly denied having any part in proposing the shooting or paying any of the assailants. He then told his life story, framed as a rags-to-riches odyssey. He recounted how he had been born in China in 1857, then moved to the U.S. at age 11, settling first in San Francisco, where he worked for relatives, before moving to New Orleans and finally Omaha. There he opened his first business with money he had saved. In 1880, he married a white woman he had met in Sunday school, and they had a son. Later he moved to New York City and opened a laundry. He claimed that he'd been forced to move to Boston after being an informant for the police during a crackdown on gambling in New York's Chinatown. After only 2 hours of deliberation, the jury found all 10 men guilty, and they were sentenced to death. The prospect of a mass execution of 10 men shocked Boston, and lent support to the anti-death penalty movement that was enjoying some success at the time. Senator James H. Vahey said that if the execution proceeded, it will seem very much like leading animals to the slaughter. The first 3 of the convicted men were executed in the electric chair at Charlestown State Prison on October 12, 1909. 3 more were executed 3 days later, while Wary Charles and the remaining prisoners were moved to death row in Charlestown. While Charles waited on death row, his wife Mary and their son Warren, who was now a Spanish-American war veteran and a New York police officer, lobbied for clemency. Governor Eben Draper would convene the governor's council to consider the request. During the ensuing hearings, many of the witnesses who had testified at the trial changed their stories. In the end, it was not enough to clear Wary Charles' name, but the governor saw fit to commute his sentence to life in prison. He would die in 1915.
Today, Chinatown's primary threat isn't a crackdown by racist police agencies, but rather the march of gentrification that threatens to price the descendants of early Chinatown residents out of the neighborhood. However, other Boston neighborhoods have not been so lucky. Just 2 weeks ago, East Boston was the site of a massive, politically motivated raid by Immigration and Customs Enforcement. While they claimed that they were trying to serve warrants on notorious violent criminals, they swept up undocumented immigrants regardless of any criminal history. The agency's gloating press release after the raid made it clear that it was using the crackdown as an retribution against Boston's status as a sanctuary city. Operation Safe City focused on cities and regions where ICE deportation officers are denied access to jails and prisons to interview suspected immigration violators, or jurisdictions where ICE detainers are not honored. Sanctuary jurisdictions that do not honor detainers or allow us access to jails and prisons are shielding criminal aliens from immigration enforcement and creating a magnet for illegal immigration. As a result, ICE is forced to dedicate more resources to conduct at-large arrests in these communities. Another notorious case in the enlightened city of Boston, and under the conduct of federal officials, where deliberately indiscriminate at-large raids target communities for intimidation.
To learn more about the 1903 Chinatown raid, the 1907 massacre, or the history of Chinatown, check out this week's show notes at hubhistory.com/049. Our episode this week relied heavily on a 1996 article by K. Scott Wong titled The Eagle Seeks a Helpless Quarry, and on a chapter in Alan Rogers' book, Murder and the Death Penalty in Massachusetts. We'll have links to both, as well as to contemporary news coverage of the shootings, a picture of the 1907 crime scene, and a portrait of Wary Charles in this week's show notes. And of course we'll have links and sources for all of this week's historical anniversaries.
If you want to get in touch with us, you can email us at podcast@hubhistory.com. We're Hub History on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Or you can go to hubhistory.com and click on the Contact Us link. And while you're on the site, hit the subscribe link and be sure that you never miss an episode. If you subscribe on Apple Podcasts, please think about writing us a brief review. It's still the best way to help others discover the show.
That's all for now. We'll be back next week with a show about the Great Brinks Robbery.